Welcome to UU A to Z. S is for Social Unitarians, Part 5, which is religion. And this time, when we start at the beginning, we really start at the beginning, because our first guy is Michael Servetus. Most people interested in Unitarian history will recognize this name. He was a true polymath, working in science, literature, philosophy, and law, but he is best remembered as a heretic who denied the Trinity. To be clear, I do not consider heretic to be an insult. Miguel Serveto was born in Spain to an infanzon family. That's the lowest level of aristocracy in Spain at the time. He first studied law to become a notary like his father. At age 15, he took a job with a Franciscan friar, Juan de Quintana. And his adventures began at age 19 when his boss became confessor to Emperor Charles V, ruler of Spain, Italy, and Germany. Miguel traveled to Germany and Italy. Like others, he turned Protestant after seeing the pomp and luxury surrounding the Pope. So he left Quintana to study and work on his own. After a few months, he published his first major book, De Trinitatis Erroribus, on the errors of the Trinity. Since work in the church was now closed to him, he assumed the name Michel de Villeneuve to duck the Inquisition, and he lived in France. After working in publishing for a few years, he went to the University of Paris, where he studied medicine while teaching math and astrology. In Michael's time, thought crime was a real and dangerous crime. He was put on trial for teaching from a pagan book on divination by Cicero, and some teachers wanted him sentenced to death for teaching Cicero. He left Paris, finished his medical training in southern France, and went to live in eastern France. In 1553, at age 42, he published Christianismi Restitutio, the restoration of Christianity. In it, while making a theological point, Michael correctly described the circulation of the blood through the chambers of the heart and the lungs. This was 2 generations before William Harvey, who gets credit for that discovery, which is actually fair to Mr. Harvey. Servetus published his statements without any proofs in an obscure work of heretical theology. Harvey released a science book at a major book fair in Frankfurt with extensive proofs and diagrams. It's kind of like Leif Erikson and Christopher Columbus. You publish wisely or perish. And speaking of perishing, Miguel had sent an early draft of his new book to one of his pen pals, a Frenchman named Jean Calvin. That's John Calvin in English. Calvin disagreed and sent back his own book, Institutes of the Christian Religion. Michael returned that with snarky counter-arguments in all the margins. After a few angry exchanges, Calvin ended the correspondence. He wrote to another friend, quote, "Servetus has just sent me a long volume of his ravings. If I consent, he will come here, but I will not give my word. For if he comes here, if my authority is worth anything, I will never permit him to depart alive." Unquote. In 1553, French authorities received 2 sets of letters from Calvin's city of Geneva, first claiming and then proving, using his correspondence with Calvin, that Miguel had written Christianismi Restitutio. Miguel was arrested in France but escaped. In absentia, the Inquisition in France sentenced him to death by burning. Miguel fled to Italy, but he stopped on the way in Geneva, where Calvin and friends had him arrested. He was tried for blasphemy and burned to death on a pile of his own books. All copies of his books were sentenced to burning in Catholic and Calvinist territory, but copies survived, and we have his books today. Actual millions of people have debated the merits of Servetus's and Calvin's arguments for actual decades, almost always without convincing each other, and we're not going to resolve that here today. Since this is a Unitarian talk, no surprise that I believe Servetus had a better case. It's not just Unitarians who criticized the Genevan Calvinists for killing Servetus. There were protesters at the time, and even today, evangelicals use it as a main propaganda point against Calvinism. And you know what? Good for them. Here comes Fausto Paolo Sozzini, an Italian in Poland. Fausto Sozzini, also known as Faustus Socinus in Latin and Faust Socin in Polish, was 28 years younger than Michael Servetus. Unitarianism was already in the family. His uncle Lelio, a skeptical biblical scholar who also knew the Quran, traveled widely and corresponded with John Calvin. He helped shape Fausto's views. Fausto was raised by his mother, his father having died when Fausto was 2. He was born in Siena. It was its own city-state at his birth, but it surrendered to Spain when Fausto was 16, and then it was joined to Florence in what they called the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. At age 17, Fausto got an inheritance from his grandfather that made him financially independent. He lived in Lyon, in Basel, and then Transylvania, now in Romania, but then part of Poland. In Poland, he engaged in long arguments with Unitarian hero Ferenc David, Francis David, and Unitarian villain Giorgio Biandrata. Giorgio eventually got David thrown into prison, where he sickened and died, but Fausto was spared. Thus we see that hair-splitting debates on the nature of Christ and the human soul were literally matters of life and death in the 16th century. But they are not today, so I will spare us the actual details. Fausto did much to formalize the beliefs of the Polish Brethren, which helped them to be a cohesive group and helped their ideas survive and thrive in the Netherlands and England after they became refugees of conscience. In those countries, they became part of the roots of modern, or at least, let's say, 19th century, British and American Unitarianism. Jumping way ahead, we get to Adams Streeter. He was a Universalist pioneer in Oxford and Milford, which are both in southern Massachusetts. And that's all I have to say about him. Nathaniel Stacy is in the next generation, and he was a pioneer Universalist in central New York State and western Pennsylvania, working as a traveling preacher. I hope it's fine that I ignore some very real theological differences between Servetus and Sozzini and between Streeter and Stacy. As a secular humanist myself, I don't always focus on hair-splitting Christian doctrine, even within our UU roots. I do want to mention that all 4 men were seen as heretics, and they all risked reprisals whenever they spoke or wrote publicly. Here's Dolphus Skinner, a Universalist minister in Utica, New York, for 40 years, where he gained many converts. He was also a teeny-tiny media mogul, merging several failing Universalist newspapers into the Evangelical Magazine and Gospel Advocate, the largest circulation Universalist newspaper in the country. In 1830, after Universalist Abner Kneeland was convicted of blasphemy, Dolphus got worried. He bought the Gospel Advocate for the express purpose of firing the unorthodox editor Orestes Brownson. And so you see some doctrinal differences I do talk about. Dolphus was on the wrong side of modern UU. Orestes went on to be a co-founder of the Transcendentalist Club with UU superstars Bronson Alcott, Theodore Parker, Henry David Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, and Elizabeth Peabody. And for some reason I don't have Ralph Waldo Emerson on the list, but he, of course, was the ringleader of that club. On the other hand, as a Universalist of his generation, Dolphus did have a point. The Transcendentalists were Unitarians, not Universalists, and not even all Unitarians were happy with the Transcendentalists. To top it off, by 1843, Orestes had converted to Roman Catholicism, renouncing his former beliefs. So perhaps Dolphus did his readers a favor by steering clear of all that drama. John Turner Sargent. This is not the John Turner Sargent who was born in 1924, the one who became CEO of Doubleday Publishing House. This is our guy. It's lucky that John and his wife came from rich shipping merchant families. After graduating from Harvard Divinity School, he did not find a job for 6 years. He finally got a job as a minister at large with the Benevolent Fraternity of Churches in the city of Boston, which had been recently organized by Joseph Tuckerman to help Boston's poor. It's an interesting process because unlike, say, for example, the Catholic Church, there's no centralized Unitarian organization at this point. The AUA doesn't really do that type of thing. So this is the churches of only Boston getting together because they decided to do so and setting up this kind of missionary activity to Boston's poor. Anyway, the Benevolent Fraternity is still active today as the UU Urban Ministry. John passed the hat around his rich relations and built the Suffolk Church Chapel in South End, where he preached for 8 years. Back then, Unitarians still had bread and wine at their Sunday services. John cut the wine to support the temperance movement. John was a strong supporter, almost a martyr, to freedom of the pulpit. When Abner Neeland was jailed for blasphemy, John signed the request that Abner be pardoned. He continued to exchange pulpits with controversial Theodore Parker when no other minister in Boston would do that. In fact, when the Benevolent Society told him he had to stop, he resigned instead. John only held 2 short ministerial posts after that, ending when he was 43 years old. He did his best work after he left the pulpit. For women's rights, he was a founder of the New England School of Design for Women. He signed a petition for women's suffrage. He was the general agent for the Guardian of Friendless Girls, and he successfully campaigned to put a woman on the board of the American Unitarian Association. As for abolition, he was a member of the Boston Vigilance Committee and the Underground Railroad, both of which protected runaway slaves. And he was president of the New England Anti-Slavery Conventions in 1859 and 1860. For social welfare, he worked with the Boston Provident Association. I actually couldn't trace that group past the 1920s. For the progress of UU thought, he continued to associate with Theodore Parker, attended meetings with the Free Religious Association, and hosted meetings of the Radical Club, which was a second wave of the Transcendentalist movement. John was born rich, but he died poor, having spent his fortune on his social causes. His funeral was well attended by Boston's famous Unitarians. There's a nice anecdote from this book of eulogies, spotted for me by his UUA biography page. Quote, "It was a touching incident at his funeral when a young woman begged a violet from the wreath on his bier. He, during his pastorate for the poor, having found her family destitute, had gone out to buy meat, which he brought to the hungry house and cooked with his own hands." Unquote. James Shrigley was a Universalist minister for several years, the oldest one alive. He was also a U.S. Army chaplain in the Civil War. Now, when James applied to be an Army chaplain, 2 Protestant ministers appealed to Lincoln to have the appointment blocked. The anecdote is in John Remberg's book entitled Abraham Lincoln, Was He a Christian? The answer, by the way, is no, Lincoln was not a Christian. Anyway, when these 2 Protestant ministers objected, to James Shrigley, Lincoln said, "On what ground do you ask the nomination withdrawn?" Response: "He does not believe in endless punishment. Not only so, sir, but he believes that even the rebels themselves will be finally saved." "Is that so?" inquired the president. "If that be so, and there is any way under heaven whereby the rebels can be saved, then for God's sake and for their sakes let the man be appointed." Here's Marilyn Sewell. She began her adult life as a minister's wife and bore 5 children. When her husband died of smallpox in 1852, she, age 28, was thrown on her own devices. She moved to Iowa, where living was cheaper, and lived as an essayist, poet, biographer, novelist, and editor, all for a Universalist audience. When her children were grown, she began preaching. She served 7 years as president of the Women's Centenary Association, later called the Association of Universalist Women. In 1877, she became the only paid Universalist missionary ever sent from America to Scotland. They liked her there. In 1880, she was ordained by the Scottish Universalist Convention, which makes her, as far as Wikipedia can learn, the first woman ordained in Europe, in any denomination. Jabez T. Sunderland was born in England but raised in America, just 35 years after John Turner Sargent. I mention that because, remember, John lost his pulpit because he supported Theodore Parker. Parker called himself a Christian, but Boston's Unitarian ministers didn't think he was Christian enough to share their pulpits, because Parker did not believe in Bible miracles or revelation. Okay, so let's see what one generation has done for us. Jabez called himself, quote, "a radical of the Theodore Parker and Emerson type," unquote. In 1882, he began a 4-year public fight with another radical, Jenkins Lloyd Jones, about the motto Jones wanted for the Western Unitarian Conference, which was freedom, fellowship, and character in religion. Jabez argued that this was not Christian enough. It was a banner that atheist freethinkers could affirm. The dispute came to a vote in 1886. Jabez moved the resolution, quote, "that while rejecting all creeds and creed limitations, the Western Unitarian Conference hereby expresses its purpose as a body to be the promotion of a religion of love to God and love to man," unquote. Now, one generation after Theodore Parker, Jabez's resolution was defeated because it was too theistic. At least in the West, which was more radical, Unitarianism had changed from a mindset where Parker's vision was too radical to a mindset where Parker's vision was not radical enough. Jabez wrote a book called The Spark in the Clod in 1902. It embraced Darwin's theory of evolution, seeing no conflict with theism. Jabez made important links to India. At age 53, after traveling in Europe and the Middle East, he went to India at the request of the British and Foreign Unitarian Association to negotiate relations with the Brahmo Samaj, an Indian religion allied with Unitarians since their founding in 1828. His trip was a great success, bringing new life to the Brahmo Samaj movement and establishing financial support from British and American Unitarians. Next, he traveled off the beaten track, including basket rides up cliffs to see Hajom Kissor, Singh's indigenous Unitarian church in the Khasi Hills. He also met the political leaders of the Indian National Congress. At this time, Mohandas Gandhi had completed his law degree in London, but was still in South Africa. Jabez met with an earlier generation of independence-minded Indians. He wrote several articles on India over the next 2 decades, culminating in his 1929 book, India in Bondage, calling for Indian independence. The book was banned in India, and praised in Time magazine. Jabez wrote many other books. One last important note, he served as minister at First Unitarian of Toronto from 1901 to 1907. Next up is Quillen Shinn, St. Paul of the Universalist Church. He's nicknamed the St. Paul for his many missionary wanderings, also for the same reason nicknamed the Grasshopper. He preached in every state and in several Canadian cities as well. When asked to put his home address in a register in 1904, he wrote, "Everywhere." He has been credited with starting 40 churches and inspiring nearly 30 persons to enter the ministry. Here's Mary Augusta Safford. In 1895, when Jabez Sunderland visited the Khasi Hills in India, that was the world's most remote Unitarian congregation. But Mary Safford and her friends in the Iowa Sisterhood, far from the liberal churches on the East Coast, may have been in the top 10. Mary co-founded a church in Hamilton, Iowa in 1879. She went on to be ordained and served in 3 other Iowa churches from 1880 to 1910. And when she retired to Orlando, Florida, excuse me, I promise you I do not have COVID. When she retired to Orlando, Florida, she founded yet another church, serving as an active member until her death. At first, I doubted if Mary was important enough to belong in this show, but then I read this Iowa joke. Question, what do the Catholics and Unitarians have in common? Answer, they both worship the Virgin Mary. I've since learned that the so-called Iowa Sisterhood is a real, it's a big thing. And Mary Augusta Safford was the, I'll call her the ringleader. Moving on, we got a guy that we just mentioned, Hajom Kissor Singh. I hope I'm pronouncing it that right. That's the best we're going to do today. And as I mentioned a few slides back, there are Unitarians in the Khasi Hills in northeastern India, about 9,000 members. Hajom Kissor Singh single-handedly got the ball rolling. Hajom was born into a pagan religion from Southeast Asia, full of rites to appease good and evil spirits. Hajom didn't buy it. He converted to a Welsh Calvinist Methodist faith, which had schools in the Khasi Hills. But he didn't buy that either. We have his diaries documenting his daily religious thoughts at the time. He thought that the Methodists had replaced fear of demons with fear of hell, and he mistrusted their hostility to Catholic missionaries. He left the Methodists and began teaching his own beliefs based on his own understanding of Jesus' life. While about 1885, he met a member of Brahmo Samaj who put him in touch with Charles Dahl, an American missionary in Calcutta. And for the very first time, Hajom learned that other people in the world thought as he did. Dahl sent him a book by William Ellery Channing, and Hajom started calling his faith Ka Niam Unitarian, the Unitarian religion. He got into correspondence with Helen Tompkins at the AUA's Unitarian Mission and with Unitarian magazine editor Jabez Sunderland, the guy who traveled to see him going partway in a basket up a cliff. On September 18th, 1887, aged just 22 years old, he held his first Unitarian service. It was for himself and 3 other people. 2 nearby villages soon joined. Unitarian magazine published their statement of faith in 1888. We believe, 1, in the unity of God, 2, in the fatherhood and motherhood of God, 3, in the brotherhood of man, 4, in love, union, worship, and faith, and 5, in immortality. In 1896, Sunderland took the long trek to meet Hajom. He wrote, quote, "I have never been more impressed with any religious movement than this in the Khasi Hills. Everywhere I saw evidences, sincerity, consecration, and warm attachment to the religious faith which the people felt had done so much for them. The whole movement is unique in the fact that it has sprung from the soil. It is my privilege to aid in the formation of a Khasi Hills Unitarian Union," unquote. Both British and American Unitarians sent funds to the Khasi Hills movement. There was a celebration of Hajom's 150th birthday in 2015. This is a Unitarian church in northeast India. And this is the then UUA president, Peter Morales, visiting the congregation. And here is a remembrance ceremony for Hajom, the man who started it all. On we go. Roy Wood Sellars was a humanist philosopher born in Seaforth, Ontario. Some of you might know that. It's east of, it's west of Toronto before you get to the Great Lakes. Roy worked as a professor at the University of Michigan. The Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy calls him, quote, "one of a generation of systematic philosophers in America, the likes of which has not been seen before or since," unquote. I wonder, is that good or bad? It also calls him a fiercely independent thinker, a far-ranging one, as you can see in his book titles: Essentials of Philosophy and Logic, Neglected Alternatives, The Next Step in Religion and in Democracy. In an era dominated by a debate between idealism and pragmatism, Roy's critical realism was neither. He was also an atheist in an era of theism and a socialist in an era of capitalism. Despite this, Roy was respected and liked in the philosophical community. Roy was one of 34 signers of the Humanist Manifesto of 1933. About half of the original signers were Unitarian, but Roy stands out. At the request of the organizer, Reverend Raymond Bragg, secretary of the Western Unitarian Conference, Roy wrote the first draft. In 1934, apparently liking what he saw in his co-signers, Roy joined the First Unitarian Church in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Here's Clarence Russell Skinner. He was a Universalist who spent 31 years at Tufts University, first as a theology professor and then as dean. His books were well received, and he has been called the most influential Universalist of the first half of the 20th century. In 1976, the UUA started a new publishing house named in his honor. Beacon Press, which is the main UU publishing title, prints fiction, nonfiction, and poetry, which is of interest to all liberal readers. I remember buying a couple of their books before I ever became a Unitarian. But Skinner House books are specifically about the UU religion. Next up, we have Clinton Lee Scott, yet another humanist Universalist minister. Unitarians are really outnumbered under the letter S for some reason. Clinton signed Humanist Manifesto 1 at age 46 and Humanist Manifesto 2 at age 86. And here's a longer guy. You may recognize the name, Waitstill Sharp. Waitstill Hastings Sharp lived 37 staid and pleasant years. He was raised in Boston, went to Harvard, became a Unitarian minister, married a sweetheart named Martha Dickey, and began raising two kids, Waitstill Jr. and Martha Jr. But then, in November 1938, By the terms of the Munich Agreement, Nazi Germany took the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Unitarians and Quakers monitoring the situation reported that 20,000 refugees needed emigration assistance. That included some of Norbert Chapek's Unitarian converts. Many of those had Jewish heritage, and all of them believed in the dangerous practice of thinking for themselves. In February 1939, the Sharps left their home and children to go help. In March, the Nazis occupied the remainder of Czechoslovakia, but the Sharps stayed in Prague and helped many to escape. In 1940, the ad hoc committee coordinating the rescue effort was renamed the Unitarian Service Committee. The Sharps remained active in it throughout the war, supporting refugees from the USC office in neutral Lisbon. The USC is still around today as the UU Service Committee. One person they helped in 1942 was Lada Hitchmanova, who was at that time a starving Czech refugee in Marseille. Lada escaped from Lisbon and went on to found the USC of Canada in 1945. Well, for risking their lives to help Jews escape from Czechoslovakia, Waitstill and Martha were named, quote, righteous among the nations, unquote, by Israel's Yad Vashem in 2006. That's the Holocaust Museum. They are 2 out of only 3 Americans to have been so recognized. Because there are over 24,000 Gentiles honored as righteous among the nations. Although millions stood by and did nothing during the Holocaust, there were tens of thousands who helped. Yeah, but most of them were Europeans because the persecutions were happening in their towns, to their friends and neighbors. Only extraordinary Americans like Waitstill and Martha left their home and children to help from inside Nazi territory. Next is James Stoll. He was the first ordained minister of any religion in the United States or Canada to come out as gay. He led the effort that convinced the UUA to pass the first ever Gay Rights Resolution in 1970. He also founded the first counseling center for gays and lesbians in San Francisco and was president of the San Francisco chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union in the 1990s. Although he escaped the AIDS plague, like too many North Americans, he died at 58 from heart and lung disease due to obesity and tobacco. Here's William G. Sinkford. He was the first black president of the UUA from 2001 to 2009. He graduated from Harvard in 1968 and spent a decade working as a marketing manager for companies like Gillette, Avon, and Revlon. He then opened his own company, Sinkford Restorations. In 1993, age 47, he began a second career in the ministry. And I suppose his marketing background was useful when he ran for election to the UUA presidency in 2001. He returned for 2 months as an interim co-president in 2017, after a new black empowerment crisis led to the resignation of Peter Morales. The presidency was then in the hands of Reverend Susan Frederick Gray. It's now in the hands of Reverend Susan Frederick Gray. And William is therefore back at the First Unitarian Church in Portland, Oregon. And this next page here doesn't actually have much to do with William Sinkford, except it happened on his watch. It turns out that we have had a schism. In 2000, a Virginian UU named David Burton decided that UU had become too weird and diverse for him. Too many atheists, too many Wiccans. What did UUs actually believe anymore? So he started his own group, espousing old-time Unitarianism, hoping to appeal to Christians and deists. He named his group the American Unitarian Association. Oh, wait a minute. That name was a problem. That's the name that William Ellery Channing gave to his association in 1825, and the UUA sued to keep ownership of the name. They settled amicably. After all, Burton and his friends are still kindred spirits. Burton renamed his group the American Unitarian Conference. Now, based on their small web presence and the fact that I only found them after 10 years of my idle researches, I'd say they have not won very many converts from the UUA. Next and last, we have Marilyn Sewell. She is a retired UU minister and author of the book Raw Faith, which documents 2 years of her life in ministry, and it has been made into a film. Marilyn received national attention after the September 11 attacks when the New York Times ran an excerpt of her sermon calling for tolerance and reason. As she told her congregation, quote, "There is a temptation, of course, to strike back with all of our force, and soon, perhaps before we are entirely sure who is the enemy. But let it not be those who have done no harm, whose only crime is having dark skin and a religion that is unfamiliar to us," unquote. And that, despite the fact that I have another picture, that is for future use, and we are done today. And I'll stop the recording.